Hey everyone, I just wanted to make a bit of a video and talk about some ethics related things that really don't come up in the readings that we've been doing lately, but I think are interesting nonetheless, and I think are relevant to the overall themes of the course. As we've been talking about all along, this is knowledge, responsibility, and society, not just ethics, but how ethics relate to epistemology and social organization. And so one thing I've been working on lately, and I'm going to be, giving some talks on, are actually robot ethics. All right, so it occurs to me that this might be an interesting kind of topic to bring up here. If you think about it, I mean, if you look at robot ethics itself, this is just the Wikipedia page that you see right here. What you can see is that there's quite a lot of work on it done. You will. If you read any science fiction, you're probably familiar with Isaac Asimov's 3 laws of robotics. So those 3 laws were interesting in the 1940s, and they are as follows. A robot may not injure a human being or through inaction allow a human being to come to harm. Robot must obey the orders given to it by human beings, except where they conflict with the first law. And finally, a robot must protect its own existence as long as protection does not conflict with numbers 1 and 2. And so for a long time, that's what's been in the kind of public imagination of, I guess, what we would think about as, sorry about that. There we go, that's what I wanted. The public imagination as to what it meant to have robot ethics, okay? And if you think about it, that makes certain assumptions. Okay, certain assumptions about what robots are, about what our relation to them is. And so, I think it's worth unpacking some of those a little bit because, it's, we're assuming that they're tools of ours, that they're made by us, and therefore, we want to imbue them with the kinds of values that will protect and support us, okay? And so that's really very much reflected in Asimov's 3 laws of robotics. I mean, it's right up front, a robot may not injure a human person. If you think about it, of course, and we've had to think about it in connection with contemporary robotics, that's a lot easier said than done. I mean, think about what we mean by robots. I mean, what Asimov meant by robots were humanoid entities that were essentially servants of ours. What we mean by robots are things like, industrial robots, robots that are essentially parts of assembly lines, robots that do things in the military, ranging from, searching for landmines, to being weapons, things of that nature. Autonomous vehicles would be robots as well. In medicine, there are more and more being developed tools for executing particular kinds of operations. And so why do we do this? I mean, is it just to put humans out of work? Well, no, not necessarily, because we assume that robots in a certain sense have certain characteristics that humans don't have. They are hopefully more reliable over time in terms of repetitive actions. They are hopefully more precise. We imagine that they are also expendable, so they can be put into dangerous situations. And, if something happens to them, it's not the same as something happening to a human. And so we make all of these assumptions about them. And what comes along with all of that are assumptions about, I guess, what their ontological nature is, like what they actually are. Okay, they're not conscious. They're not humans. They're not intelligent in some sense that we would call intelligent, although clearly they have, they're computerized and they have memory and they have decision-making capabilities. More and more we realize that they can, when networked, they learn. I mean, there's lots of recursive systems in which repetitive action allows robots to learn from experience and not simply learn from programming. The more you network robots not only with each other but with other kinds of information systems, you can also imagine robots constructing a kind of representation of a world. Okay, and so I guess the question is, how do you think about ethics in that context, right? I mean, the only people that are going to be building robots really are, large-scale corporations, institutions, things of that nature, at least, the really complex ones. You can build little ones on Arduino platforms and like small sorts of things, but, most of them we think of as being much more complicated than that. The question, I think, still remains, how do we think about ethics in a world with these kinds of entities in them, okay? We, I think, want or still want to think about robots in terms of being tools of ours, and therefore we have certain kinds of responsibilities towards them and certain kinds of responsibilities we don't have towards them, okay? If they are not conscious, if they are not imbued with the same kind of value as humans have, then they are on a lower level than we are, okay? Fair enough. And I'm not going to argue that they are anything, that they are conscious or anything like that. I think we can take that as a given. But we have seen in the past when we have made certain kinds of assumptions about beings not like us. So I'm thinking about cultural philosophy, where Europeans made assumptions about those from other places, right? And they put them on a lower ethical pedestal. That's why we could have slavery. That's why we could have all sorts of things like that. And you're probably thinking right now, well, wait a minute. Are you trying to smuggle in, something about, robots having a kind of agency or having a kind of ontological status like us? And the fact is I'm not, but the fact also is that when we were telling those stories about those other cultures, we found it very easy to convince ourselves that they were below others. We even put them in theological terms. They were lesser creations of God or something of that nature. So what I'm interested in is the kind of, I guess you would say, limited scope of knowledge that we have at any given time. It's not like we had a limited amount of knowledge in the past, but now we know. Now we know where to classify ourselves and robots and all of those sorts of things. I'm more interested in saying we don't know. And if we don't know, what are our ethical responsibilities towards what we don't know yet? Here's another, I guess, aspect to all of this. What we've seen in robot ethics are, an attempt to, I guess, control. I mean, if you look at some of the kinds of books that are out there, we have Robot Rules Regulating Artificial Intelligence. This particular one is mostly on how to, let's go to the table of contents here. So this one is Robot Rules. And so, this one, as you can see, is about features of AI, responsibilities towards AI, rights for AI, legal personality, and so forth. So it's interested in, thinking about some of those sorts of questions. We have, projects like this, Ethics for Robots, How to Design a Moral Algorithm, right? And so in this one, this is quite a recent book. I'm going to go down to the table of contents. So it's taking up, topics that we would recognize in ethics and thinking about how robots would fit into all of those sorts of things. Towards safe robots. So here's a book, and this is a recent one. This is 2014, Approaching Asimov's First Law. We have things, love and sex with robots, because that's clearly a question of ethics as well, right? What are human relations with robots? What happens when they become integrated into other kinds of social spheres with humans? Robot Ethics 2.0, From Autonomous Cars to Artificial Intelligence. Just Ordinary Robots, Automation from Love to War. This is all recent literature on the questions around robot ethics. Sometimes we think about the ethical questions as being really ultimately related to artificial intelligence. Like, if we can get that right, we'll get robots right. it seems to me that the thing about a robot is that it's embodied in the world. In other words, its learning comes in part from the learning about artificial intelligence, or that happens within artificial intelligence. So that's algorithms, that's control functions, and so forth. But robots also have to learn dealing with the physical world, much the way we have to learn, right? When you're born and when you grow up, you can't walk, you can't run, you learn to do those things. And so, we are learning ways to teach robots how to learn from the world, okay, as well as how to learn from each other. Now, all of that means, it seems to me, that we have a situation in which we're setting up robots with a set of cognitive abilities, or with a set of a cognitive space that looks a lot like ours, but is not ours, right? We have particular kind of cognitive relationship to the world. We learn in certain ways. With robots, they have an analogous one, but not an identical one to us. And that, to me, raises questions as well. How do we act towards these things that have a kind of cognitive history and a cognitive future to them? In other words, there comes a point at which we can't simply say they are just their programming anymore. They are whatever a human programmer put into them. At some point, we have to say they are something which is gathering data and information in ways that human programmer could not have anticipated. That poses problems for certain scenarios. You're probably familiar with scenarios around autonomous vehicles, right? How is it that we can program something in for one of those vehicles to determine what to do in a situation where somebody is likely to get killed? Okay, a human driver, and I think this is fairly likely. Autonomous vehicles are likely to be much safer overall than human drivers are overall. We make lots of mistakes. However, we can imagine specific situations where a robot has to choose between hitting this person and hitting that person. How do you design an algorithm for that? What happens when that algorithm starts mutating and doing and learning in other kinds of ways, starts to assign different kinds of values to the objects in the world? Maybe that's a good thing, because maybe what it does is to see options that the rest of us don't see, ways to not kill anyone. That's a possibility. On the other hand, it could end up, assigning values that we would not assign ourselves, right? If you've seen the movie I, Robot with Will Smith, there's a scene in it where he talks very much in those terms. He says that he was saved by a robot, and a young girl was left to die. And he says a human would have known that the young girl was the one worth saving, not him. And so, with all of these questions, it seems to me we've got a much more complicated environment to think about ethics than it may seem on the surface. The knee-jerk reaction is just to say they're just our tools, they're just, a thing not like us, and all we have to do is design into them, a set of ethical requirements, and that's the end of it. But as soon as you make these things cognitive machines that learn, machines in which, which interact with the world and which have the potential of mutating, and I'm talking mutating in terms of its algorithms and so forth. As soon as you come to that, now we have to think about how we relate to these, at least to some extent, on the same order that we would relate to a non-human life form. And we don't have to call these life forms, but it's going to end up being something very similar to that anyway. Okay? So now it seems to me we're in the realm of something like environmental ethics, right? How do we deal with animals in the world, right? They're not human, but they are cognitive beings. So the reason I'm telling you all of this is to try and get you to think about how ethics works when the easy divisions that we have between us and everything else kind of start eroding and don't really look the way we've always assumed that they look. What do our institutions have to look like in order for an ethical world to be created, right? Are corporations going to be the best kinds of spaces for deciding on those sorts of things, right? Or are corporations going to be mostly interested in their own bottom lines? Is the military going to be the best kind of space for that? Maybe, maybe not, right? The military has other kinds of imperatives. Is the government going to be the best space? What's the best kind of social organization space to decide on these things? Is the university? I mean, we could think about a lot of different options. And so I mostly want to raise questions here and not answer them because I think there's a lot of interesting stuff going on here. So anyway, that is just a few initial thoughts on ethics in robots.